welcome everyone to this Diagnosing China's Economy hosted by the 21st Century China Center at UCSD. My name is Rui Jia. I'm a professor of economics at GPS. We are honored today to have 4 truly distinguished economists with us. For anyone working on China's economy, they are household names and really need no introduction. I have been following their work since I was a student, and now their research has been a large part of what I would teach at UCSD. These are Professor Yao Yang from Peking University and the Shanghai University of Economics and Finance, Professor Loren Brandt from University of Toronto, Professor Chang-tai Hsieh from University of Chicago, and Professor Shang-jin, who will be joining us virtually. Just a quick word on the format. We have 2 exciting panels. Panel 1 focuses on China's domestic economy. Professor Yao Yang would first give a 20-minute talk, followed by a 10-minute discussion by Professor Loren Brandt. And then our own Barry Norton will moderate 15 minutes discussion and Q&A. Panel 2 turns to China and the global economy. Professor Shang-jin would give a 20-minute talk first, followed by, again, 10 minutes discussion by Chang-tai, and again, Barry would moderate the discussion and the Q&A. I'm, very eager to hear their perspective, so I just shut up, and please join me in welcoming Professor Yao Yang.
Thank you, Rich, for this nice introduction. I have to say that Rich is a proud product of the National School of Development from Peking University. So it's really a kind of pride and also a privilege for me to come to UCSD and then have this conference with her here. So I was assigned the task to talk about China's domestic economy. I want to start with kind of a puzzle about the Chinese economy. So for anyone who just pay a little bit attention to the Chinese economy, you're going to find that on the one hand, China's technological progress over the last decade has been really, really fast. But on the other hand, it seems that the Chinese domestic economy is really sluggish, right? So on technological side, we see that China is leading on EVs, on power batteries, and also in many aspects of AI, particularly on the application side of AI. And talking about the China's EVs, many people want to say, hey, it's because China has those really powerful and low-cost batteries. And not just that, if you sit in a Chinese-made EV, you're going to be amazed by the functions the car can provide you. It's actually an AI box. You can ask the car anything you want. Actually, I just saw on a short video, American who actually drove a Xiaomi car, and that car could detect which car is a police car. That's a little bit scary, but that's how Chinese car makers are making cars to become really smart cars, right? So, but of course, if you look at the manufacturing side, China dominates the global manufacturing, the whole trade and also production, right? China accounts for 35% of total global manufacturing output, okay? But on the other hand, if you look at China's domestic economy, you're going to see, hey, the economy is so sluggish, right? Last year, the official data is that China's economy grew by 5%. And many people don't believe it, right? Including my friends, in the United States. They say, hey, those numbers are just a fake. But if you break up those the growth number, then you're going to see probably it makes sense. First, out of this 5% total growth, 1.6 percentage points were contributed by China's export, right? So China's export last year is so strong. It's just out of people's imagination. People all thought, including me myself, because of the trade war, China's export should not be good. But eventually, last year, China's export grew by almost 7%, right? And with a record high of trade surplus of 1.2 trillion US dollars. Huge, right? So that directly accounts for 1.6% growth. And China has deflation. Deflation contributes another 1%. So domestically, if you only look at China's nominal growth rate, domestically, it was only 2.4%. Okay, so that's about right, I think, to me. Okay, so why we have this kind of two extremes, right? On one hand, China seems to advance on technology. On the other hand, China's domestic economy is really lagging behind, right? Actually, nominal growth in China for the last several years have been lower than nominal growth rate in the United States. So that's why the gap in terms of nominal GDP between U.S. and China has been enlarging, not shrinking. Okay. My explanation rests with the objective of the Chinese leadership. Okay. The objective in their minds is that China should strengthen manufacturing sector. China should put all the efforts into innovation. Okay. So let me dive a little bit into what China has done over the last 7-8 years since 2018, right? So before 2018, particularly between 2012 and 2018, China had a massive liberalization program in its financial sector, right? One of the indicators is this huge growth in so-called shadow banking sector, okay? And then that kind of set alarm to the Chinese leadership. And they believed that this was not the right track for China to go. So then at the end of 2017, the government started this massive deleveraging program, sudden deleveraging, right? So it got rid of most of the P2P business, okay? P2P, or is it a person-to-person business, okay? And then cut credit supply to many companies. So immediately, in a matter of 1 year, about, 20 to 30 private companies, listed companies just died out because of this credit crunching, okay? So that was a very serious impact on the real economy. But in the minds of the leadership, that was the necessary cost to clean up the house, right? Because the Chinese economy was too leveraged, okay? And then in 2021, the government started another massive program on the housing sector. I mean, during the pandemic, first year of the pandemic, and the Chinese, particularly the first 3 months, the Chinese economy was really bad because the whole country was shut down, right? But by the end of 2020, the Chinese economy came back. And by 2021, the housing market came back. And there was a huge rise of prices. And then the leadership sensed that was not the right direction for the Chinese economy to go. So there's a huge also deleveraging program was started on the housing sector, credit was restricted to those real estate companies, right? So then you see over the last, now, almost the fifth year, prices have been declining all the way down, right? And the sales volume declined all the way down. So in terms of sales, sales volumes has been halved. At the highest point in 2021, China sold 1.8 billion square meters. Okay, so now only barely 900 million square meters. Okay, and on the price side, almost the same, right? In most of the cities, prices declined by 30 to 40%. In some cities, even more than that, right? Basically, for Chinese households, on average, we have lost about 120 trillion RMB in wealth, right? That's huge, okay? But that's not the end of the story. After the pandemic, the government started another program to deleverage local governments. I mean, local governments are heavily indebted, particularly during the pandemic period of time, because of the lockdown. Local governments spend a huge amount of money on lockdown, okay? But, you know, in other countries, then the central government, or in the U.S., the federal government, right, began to borrow a lot and to spend a lot. In China, we have done the opposite, okay? And the central government didn't rescue, bail out the local governments. Instead, the central government asked the local governments to repay the debts, okay? So every province was asked to repay. 12 provinces are better. Central government gave them quotas so they can borrow new money to pay their old money, so called a debt swap, okay? But for the rest of the province, sorry, you have to repay your debts out of your own pockets, okay? So this is so contractionary, okay? Of course, there have been other programs kind of similarly contractionary, but I believe those three were the most serious on the economy. But like I said, for the leadership, they believe this is just a necessary cost, okay? So then if you read the 15th five-year plan, you see the two top priority for the next 5 years or even 10 years, okay? Number one, to build a strong and more complete manufacturing sector, okay? Although Chinese manufacturing sector is already the largest in the whole world, okay? And second, China will double down on the investment into R&D and high-tech investment. For the first time, the government proposed self-sufficiency in technology, okay? And also, the report puts a lot of emphasis on 0 to 1 innovation, okay? Why the Chinese government puts so much attention to manufacturing and innovation? Number one is, China proposed 2 centennial goals. One was to eradicate poverty. We did that. Then the second centennial goal was by 2049, China is going to become modernized, socialist, and a strong country, right? So-called Chinese national rejuvenation, okay? So to do that, for the leaders, they believe the only way to go is to invest into manufacturing and innovation. And second, a reason that's related to U.S. China relations, in the background is always this U.S. China competition, okay? And also the Taiwan issue, right? I mean, the goal for the leadership is still peaceful reunification is the priority, right? First choice. But in order to do that, China has to build a strong military that can rival American military. So in a sense, they want to use this as kind of a guarantee, right, for peaceful reunification between mainland and Taiwan, right? But to me, the costs, right, are really high, particularly in the short time, right? Think about the housing sector and local government, okay? They, adding together, they account for 50% of China's domestic demand. Right? Local governments in China are not like local governments, state government in the U.S. Local governments in China spend a lot, not just on consumption, but also on investment. Okay, so local governments' spending accounts for 35% of total demand in China. Then the housing sector, another 15%. So adding together, 50%. So 50% of the economy is declining, right? So in order to make the economy growing, you have to overcome this decline first. That's hard, okay? So I think that explains why, on the one hand, technology is growing so fast in China, but on the other hand, the Chinese domestic demand is so sluggish, right? So I do want to oppose, the way that the government approached the 15th five-year plan, but probably the government should pay more attention to short-term demand, and particularly those two sectors, right? We have proposed a lot of solutions to the government, but I think the government is not determined which way to go. To some extent, the two goals as kind of conflicting to each other. That is, they take a static view toward the economy. You have a kind of fixed pie. If you spend more on consumption, you're going to spend less on manufacturing innovation, right? So if you look at the money, where the money goes to manufacturing, innovation, not to subsidizing people's consumption. So it's going to take us a while, finally, for the central government to realize probably domestic consumption is going to be the obstacle for China's growth. And let me stop here. Then in the discussion session, we can talk more. Thank you.
I'd like to focus, on two things. I want to focus on this diagnosis business in terms of diagnosing the Chinese economy. And I also want to perhaps to kind of highlight that when we take a look at what's going on in the Chinese economy and we take a look at what's going on today, that if we take too short-term of a perspective, don't take a longer perspective, that what we're fundamentally going to do is to miss what the kind of the key problems are in terms of the Chinese economy. So let me just try to explain. If you want to diagnose what's going on in the economy, one of the things that you need is data. And as economists are trying to kind of track what's going on with the Chinese economy, we need data, and we need data of a variety of sorts. One kind of data that we need is the macro level data. This is data that all statistical agencies go ahead and generate and report. It's the national income accounts. It tells us how much GDP happens to be growing every year, provides a breakdown of GDP between agriculture, manufacturing, and services. It tells us on the expenditure side of the economy how much is coming from consumption and investment, government expenditure, and net exports. And on the income side, it tells us, okay, well, how much income is going to households and wages and earnings, how much happens to be going to firms in the form of profits, how much is depreciation, how much happens to be taxes. Those are just kind of fundamental numbers to any kind of story that we like to tell, and we do like to tell stories, but we like to tell stories that hopefully are grounded, again, in some really solid data that then gets informed by the economics. From kind of my perspective, probably over the course of the last 15 years, and as someone who spent far too much time, trying to collect data, do surveys in China, since probably 07, 08, we've just run into serious problems with respect to data, both on the side of reliability and on the side of access. And so just to kind of speak to reliability, Chang-tai is over there, but a few years ago, Chang-tai and his colleagues did a very wonderful paper that was what I would call a forensics analysis of China's national income accounting data. And what they learned in this paper, in this analysis, so they're looking at a paper 2008 to 2016, is that one of the things, again, that they say is, well, look, it appears as if that the official numbers that are coming out of the National Bureau of Statistics, that they're over-reporting how rapidly the economy is growing, somewhere between 1.5% and 2% a year. Right? So this is over an 8-year period. They also suggest that almost all of the over-reporting on the product side of the economy is occurring in manufacturing. On the expenditure side, it's occurring in investment. Now, 1.5%, 2% annual basis when an economy happens to be growing at 8 or 10% doesn't seem like an awful lot. Compound that over 8 years, and all of a sudden you're up to 15% or 20%. Manufacturing happens to represent 40% of the economy. If all of the measurement error happens to be in manufacturing, it means that the estimates of how rapidly manufacturing is growing are overestimated by 3 or 4%. The same kinds of problems on the investment side. So for those of us who are trying to make sense of what's going on in this economy in the aggregate, we have fundamental data problems. These reporting problems don't stop in 2016. They're just as bad in 17, 18, and 19. And the problems during COVID are also extremely bad. So we have almost 15 years of aggregate economic activity in China, where what I would say, and maybe some people agree and don't, it is extremely difficult to extract signal from the noise. It's gotten a lot harder for us who happen to be doing this kind of work to be able to, in some sense, with any high degree of confidence, to have things and facts that we feel firmly about. So that's kind of point number one. The second problem that we run into is data accessibility. We like to do things kind of from the micro up. Yeah, we can tell macro stories, but everybody in this room uses firm-level data, uses household-level data. Firm-level data, we're using data for hundreds of thousands of firms. We have enormous amounts of information. We try to go ahead and looking at the analysis of firms, we try to aggregate that behavior up so it's consistent with what we see at the aggregate level. We have wonderful firm-level data up till 2007. We have done enormous amounts of analysis up through 2007, what's going on in the manufacturing sector, where all the dynamism is coming from, why China has been so successful. Wonderful data. The problem that we run into is that after 2007, the data that we've all been using is being generated by the National Bureau of Statistics. It's seriously flawed. And the problems that Chang-tai and his colleagues identify in the macro data, well, what's underlying that are the firm-level data that the NBS is in fact collecting. We can no longer use those data after 2007. We have no firm-level data after 2007 to be able to analyze in any serious way what is going on in the manufacturing sector. We have no firm-level data for the tertiary sector. So here is someone who's just kind of myself, this is my own kind of perspective. We are missing an enormous amounts of information that we need to be able to tell coherent, logically consistent stories that we can at least be confident in. And so over my academic career, I've always known what I don't know. Well, remember what Rumsfeld once said? It's the unknown of the unknown. That's what really bothers me today. Because you can't diagnose what you don't know. So that's kind of my first observation. The second observation that I want to make is that I'm very sympathetic to what Yao was talking about, some of the short-term problems that China happens to be facing. And these are these problems kind of on the demand side and just low household expenditure. All right. If you take a longer run perspective of what's been happening in the Chinese economy, we can go back 15 or 20 years, and I would say that the genesis of this problem in the Chinese economy, the slowdown that we've gone ahead and observed, and what I would say is the fundamental puzzle about the Chinese economy, you have to go back 15 years ago, and you have to go back to the financial crisis. And so if you look at the financial crisis and kind of how the Chinese economy was behaving before the financial crisis, this was an economy that was growing 8 or 10% a year. This was an economy where productivity growth in the economy was very robust, where productivity growth, its contribution, direct and indirect, was on the order of 65 to 70% of all of the growth that we observe. China's growth and success in lots of ways is a productivity story. And all of the reforms, the internal, the external liberalization reforms, make that happen. After 2007, we have an economy that I would argue goes from growing at 8 or 9% to about 3%. What is the reason? The fundamental reason is because all of the dynamism, all of the productivity that had been there before, it's disappeared. Productivity growth is 1/3 to 1/4 of what it had been before. And the fundamental question about the Chinese economy is like, why? If you look at everything that they've done over the course of the last 15 years, the enormous investments in human capital, in education, the enormous investments in R&D, the enormous investments in infrastructure, the enormous investments in plant and equipment, all of those things that one would expect to have helped to sustain productivity growth in the economy and would have allowed the economy to continue to be able to continue to grow. Would it have grown at 8%? We were talking about this dinner the other night. No, it wouldn't have grown at 8%, but it probably would have been able to grow at 6%. And so when you ask yourself these questions, to me, that's the puzzle. And the fundamental puzzle is that despite all these massive investments that they've made, this is an economy where on the productivity side, the supply side of the economy, which is what determines how rapidly an economy grows over the long run, it's the productivity problem. And so when I look at these problems that China happens to be facing, I see fundamental shifts that begin not with Xi Jinping, not with Donald Trump, although all of those things have amplified in a variety of ways. I can go back to the mid-2000s, and I begin to see fundamental shifts in this economy. This is an economy that becomes less open rather than more open. This is an economy that is much more focused on rather being a very successful technology fast follower, wants to be a technology leader. This is an economy that rather than being more market-led becomes more state-led, rather than being more bottom-up becomes more top-down. There are fundamental changes in terms of how this economy works and functions, how firms are incentivized, how cadres and officials are incentivized. As I said, it doesn't begin with Trump and the trade wars. It doesn't begin with Xi Jinping. This is there long before. And although all of those things have amplified these policy tendencies, this begins before. And there is a very interesting puzzle about why an economy and a manufacturing sector that demonstrates this incredible technological excellence. I mean, over my career, I've probably visited 500 firms, and I'm a firm believer and a big fan of Chinese entrepreneurs. Just love them. They're fantastic. They're incredible in terms of all the things that they do. But the puzzle is that you have a manufacturing sector today where there's all this kind of excellence. But man, this is a sector where productivity growth has largely disappeared. It's a sector where you have enormous amounts of excess capacity. This is a sector where profitability, well, firms aren't making money at all. That's the contradiction. And so you have to ask yourself, what is the nature from a policy perspective that just has gone ahead and just eliminated all the dynamism on the supply side? Well, all these subsidies and support, it's as if the rest of the economy is effectively socializing all these investments that have been made on the supply side and are in fact the source of all of the low productivity growth that we observe. To me, that's the fundamental puzzle that we should be asking. I think that Yao is right. We have these short-term problems, but there's a deeper one. And if you want to diagnose and you want to figure out how to fix it, you need to go back a little bit earlier for figuring out where the problems are.
Tremendous remarks. Let's turn the microphone back over to Yaoyang for a minute, and maybe I can, because we're going to open it up to the whole floor, but obviously Lawrence posed some really fundamental questions, and let me add one, and then after your response we'll go to the audience. But let me add to that question the what do we do right now question. In other words, Loren is saying, hey, a lot of this is more deeply embedded. Okay, fine. But then there's also a question, what would you be doing tomorrow if you were in charge of economic policy in China?
Well, let me first respond to Loren's comments. I think my remarks don't conflict with Loren's comments, right? To me, the turning point was 2018 when the government started this deleveraging program. And then together with those measures, of course, there has been a lot of centralization, right? And of course, that's going to affect entrepreneurs' confidence in the economy. And that's all related, okay? But to me, yeah, we economists are concerned about, productivity, those kind of hard things. But in China, everything is political, right? You have to go into the minds of the politicians and think about how they think about things, okay? That's, to me, first order, okay? So you have to think about the first order thing over there, okay? Otherwise, we cannot solve China's problem and get the right diagnosis, okay? Then to answer Barry's question, so what's next? I think it's we're clear. If we have the right diagnosis, then the prescription is just clear, right? We have to pay attention to the short-term issues. Right? I don't think in the long run, Chinese economy has a series of problems, okay? The bottleneck today is just a lack of demand. Everyone in China knows this and believes in it. And how to pump up domestic demand? It's clear we have to stop the decline of the housing sector. Okay, when the housing sector is declining, when people are being ripped off, right, every day, there will be no demand. We have lost 120 trillion in a matter of 5 years, okay? So the wealth effect, the confidence issue, all there, right? So over the last several years, I have been calling for the central government to set up a specific agency to buy those excessive houses, or at least to buy those defaulted houses. Many people don't know, over the last several years, each year, about 800,000 families defaulted on their mortgage. Okay? I mean, for any other country, that would be a financial crisis, right? And the United States has the two agencies, anyway, to protect those people who take mortgages. In China, we don't have such an organization. We should have one, okay? So the central government has realized the problem, but the central government doesn't want to take the responsibility. It asks the local governments to do that, provincial government to do that. And then provincial governments ask city government to do that. And city government ask the district governments to do that. And of course, the district governments don't have any capacity to do that, okay? So that's number one. Number two, more seriously, we have to bail out the local governments. Local governments are not just heavily indebted, they also run huge budget deficits. That's so serious because they don't have money, so they don't pay their employees. In some provinces, it's just ridiculous. Government employees have to use their apartments as mortgage, as collateral to get loans. So, and use the loan to do what? To pay their salaries. That's outrageous, right? And local governments don't pay their contractors. And most of those contractors are private companies, okay? No one knows the exact size of this deficit, but that's huge, okay? And the central government has realized this too. So it allows local governments to borrow new debts to fill those deficits. But the size is not enough, and the pace is too slow. And the third one is we have to do a debt restructuring, okay? There's no other way to go out of this debt issue, okay? Zhu Rongji did it 25 years ago. And he did it successfully, right? Today, I think it's much easier than Zhurongji time to do debt restructuring because local governments have a huge amount of assets. Okay, all right, and also, most of the debts are held by local governments, and the creditors are just state-owned banks or financial institutions. I mean, to me, you just write off, right? It's just one pocket and another pocket. That's the difference. Okay, why you care? This is basically it's public to public. You just write it off. Okay, I'm joking, but because local governments have so much assets, they can just easily sell off those assets, right? And then to pay those debts, and then you just have some haircuts. You can just get by. And then the central government realized this, and central government doesn't want to do this. Instead, they ask the local governments to do this. Now 2 provinces, Hubei and Hunan, are trying to do this. But there's no way, there's no market, right? Because people don't have confidence. And so it has to be the central government to start this restructuring program to create this market, right? And so with those 3 things, I think the Chinese economy will come back on track.
So in other words, before we can address the long-term issues, which Loren suggests may be there or may not, there's fundamental crisis-level financial conditions to wrap up first. Chang-tai wanted to say a word, and his name was taken, so he deserves the right to jump in.
So I want to just push you a bit on the let me just call it the campaign for innovation and the campaign for manufacturing. Sorry, can you hear me now? Or does the mic on? Yeah. So yeah, I want to ask you about the campaign for manufacturing and the campaign for innovation, and I want to say that just to reiterate a point that Loren made, which is that there's this basic fact, right, that TFP growth has slowed dramatically. And so it's not just a short-run financial problem. It's that so they're the measurement issues in the aggregate data that I'm well aware of. But TFP growth is supposed to be the aggregation of innovation. So if all this effort at innovation has worked, it should show up. It should aggregate into measures of aggregate TFP. But measures of aggregate TFP, they go the other way, right? They're about as low as you can think. And I actually think that the numbers are roughly right in this case, right? The numbers, and I wonder whether it's about the way in which these two I'll call it a campaign purposefully, that at how it's taken place, and also thinking about maybe I'm going to ask the political scientists in the room to try to chime in on what are the political forces behind this, on why manufacturing, what's so special about manufacturing versus services, like why not services, like why and also so why is Shanghai Semiconductor so special and Alibaba not? Oh, why is innovation important? So I'll ask the sort of 2 questions. Well, one is that if one was convinced that this effort at innovation has led to, on aggregate, less innovation, would that matter? And I'll ask like a counterfactual question. Like, suppose that you were to present senior party officials with the following proposition, which is you can do something in which you can make Shanghai Semiconductor the leading semiconductor company in the world, that it would replace Taiwan Semiconductor. But the costs are enormous, and the cost is going to lower GDP by 3%. Would the party say, that's a great deal, I'll take it? Or would they say, no, of course not. I want the innovation, but not at those costs.
Oh, for your first question, you are expert on that, right, on TLP, but I'm a serious doubter about the TLP or merit of the TLP. I don't think that exactly reflect a country's capability to innovate. Okay, particularly on innovation, I don't think the TLP really works. But on the more technical side, I would say, over the years since probably, I don't know, 2015, there have been a lot of slacks in the Chinese economy that you cannot measure, right? So currently, our utilization rate is only, for equipment, it's only about 70%, right? So that can explain a lot of the discrepancy you observe. And if you look at the employment, that's the same thing. People are employed, but the people don't have full employment. Okay, all sorts of things. To your second question, I don't think they think in this way. You have to sacrifice growth in order to have innovation. Probably in the politician's mind, if we do innovation, we are going to pull the economy. And probably they also help that with innovation, we can make up the loss on the demand side. Okay, although I don't believe so, but it's really hard to persuade them that emphasizing on innovation is the wrong way.
This is a question more related to productivity and industrial output in the Chinese economy. Are there any concerns that the focus on high technological output instead of focusing on industry in the long term will create situations similar to that of the Rust Belt in America?
No. Chinese companies are investing heavily outside China, but China is huge, right? And also because the government emphasizes manufacturing so heavily, right? So innovation is not going to replace manufacturing. Okay? I don't think that's going to happen in China.
I want to make a point here. I think that one of the problems that you see in the economy today, if you take a look at the employment numbers in the manufacturing sector, is that what you see is that the government has encouraged in lots of ways capital formation, investment, automation, robotics, and lots of manufacturing industry. They haven't done it very inefficient. They haven't done it very efficiently, which is why the productivity happens to be so low. And if you take a look at the number of individuals who are working in manufacturing today, it in fact has been declining over the course of the last 8 years. And where are these workers being absorbed? They are being absorbed, a lot of them in very low-paying tertiary service sector jobs. This is an economy that, in addition to the productivity problem, has an enormous problem in terms of being able to absorb the people who are entering in the labor market. There's just like a massive mismatch that happens to be going on in this economy in terms of the labor market. And that I would argue that fundamentally it's about misallocation of resources. You misallocate resources to certain sectors. You've misallocated where you direct resources to R&D. You've misallocated your resources in terms of higher education. And today, kids who are coming out of university are having very hard time finding jobs. There are very few jobs in the manufacturing sector. So there's just a massive, as a consequence of the policy and the priorities of the policy that I would argue are at least 15 years old, it's contributed to just the way in which it has enormous influence on the way in which resources are being allocated. And you get this unusual combination of, yes, you get innovation, you get some very good firms, but that just is in fact not going to be the model that's going to be able to be sustainable and going to generate growth, because at the same time you get some very good EV companies, you get lots of other not so good EV companies, and you get enormous amounts of resources that end up being absorbed in really bad EVs, and that just kind of pulls down productivity and just kind of contributes to these problems and the malaise that the economy happens to have.
Yao Yang, I'm struck by the fact that the three drivers of slower growth that you identified are all related to government policy. So these are contractionary government policies. And are you convinced that all of these were mistakes, or were they necessary because, for example, you had this real estate bubble, you had shadow banking that was leading to a lot of risks in the financial system. So, I mean, are the decision makers bad decision makers for making these mistakes, or are these things that actually had to be done because the Chinese economy was so bubbly that it needed contraction?
Well, after observing the politicians' decisions in China for so long, now I believe they actually think reversely like we think, opposite to what we think. They always set the objectives first. Okay? I think the objectives is that we have to do manufacturing, we have to do innovation. So how to do that? They don't ask the question whether the economy is wrong or right. You just say, hey, the current situation, the current status are not going to lead to my objective. So let's change it. Okay? But the problem is that this kind of thinking can be wrong, can lead the economy to the wrong direction. For example, between 2012 and 2018, because of this rise of shadow banking, the Chinese innovation was so vibrant. By 2017, the number of unicorns in China was larger than the number in the U.S. Today, we only have about barely half of the American number. I mean, Xi Jinping actually asked this question when he had a workshop with entrepreneurs. Okay, but to me, it's so clear, right? In that period of time, between 2012 and 2018, we had a vibrant financial sector, and that sector supported the innovation. And today, particularly the VC sector just died out. No wonder we don't have more unicorns. Okay. So, to me, I'm an economist. I feel really sad about my profession in China.
Now, we're going to continue this discussion, but we also want to bring in Shang-jin, right? Are we queued up for that, for his Zoom entry? And it's definitely, we're not leaving these topics by any means. And also I want to specify for the audience, when we talk about total factor productivity being down in China, what we mean is the growth rate is slower. We're not saying the level of productivity is lower. We mean a slower growth rate. As economists, we shouldn't speak in such a sloppy way. Shang-jin is going to bring in international as part of this, but I know for sure that the underlying discussion, the underlying drivers are still going to be about the configuration of Chinese policy, this remarkable discrepancy that Yaoyang underlined and that Loren talked about between certain types of vibrant technological achievement on one hand, but also persistent, sluggish economic problems on another. Shang-jin, welcome. It's a delight to see you. Thanks for coming in virtually, and I'm going to turn over the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. So I am assigned to discuss international aspects of the Chinese economy. I'm going to start with some news. As you know, Chancellor Merz of Germany has just concluded his visit to China. On Chinese media, on TikTok and so on, the focus has been about the Chinese robotics performance in front of the Chancellor. In German international media, the focus is somewhat different. We know just before Chancellor's visit, Chinese official number confirmed that Chinese trade surplus last year exceeded $1 trillion, quite a bit of over $1 trillion, first time for any country in world history. And when Chancellor Merz was in China, he called for a rebalancing of Germany's what he called unhealthy trade ties, and his request is basically for China to import more, export less. And that's not Germany unique request. In previous weeks and months when other international leaders visited China, so I have President Macron of France, Canadian Prime Minister Carney, and Australian Prime Minister Albanese featured on my second slide. Virtually all of them call for China to take policy reforms that would increase its imports, and also to modify policies that, in their mind, lead to China's excessive exports. And that's what I want to talk about in my remarks. Now, of course, the international discussion about Chinese trade surplus didn't start from this month or last. In fact, China has had a surplus for now more than two decades. Various international dialogues so far have not really yielded any dramatic moderation of this surplus, at least in dollar amount. Now, is it the case that China is oblivious to this, that China had tried nothing to try to correct this? You cannot quite say this. Interestingly, since 2018, China has a state-sponsored, state-subsidized import promotion program that the government spent millions and millions of dollars to build a gigantic physical structure in the Hongqiao area of Shanghai to host annual China International Import Expo, a gigantic structure dedicated to promote imports into China. Now, you ask yourself, how many countries do you know that have a government program using taxpayer money to try to promote and sponsor imports? And this is a high-profile program. Chinese, essentially either Chinese president or the prime minister, they will take turns to go to this annual events. If you look at a time series of Chinese trade surplus, and you ask yourself, suppose you give your student a question. So China introduced this gigantic state-subsidized import promotion program starting from 2018, starting from some year. Here's a time series picture of Chinese trade surplus. Guess which year China introduced this program? From the trade surplus picture, you cannot detect any sign of this import promotion program. So this program is certainly not working effectively in terms of reducing exports minus imports. So what I want to do in the next 15 minutes or so is to discuss with you the following few questions. Why does China have a large trade surplus that began in the mid-1990s, peaked around 2008, and continue to stay high at approximately 2% of its GDP? What are the roles of industrial policies and trade policies in this trade surplus and current account surplus picture? Why doesn't China's own import promotion program work? And next question, what does sex or sex ratio have to do with China's trade surplus? And what does discrimination against private sector entrepreneurs have to do with the trade surplus questions? These are the questions I'm going to focus on. There are other things we can discuss, but I won't have time in my initial remarks, but happy to entertain them during the Q&A sessions. Okay, so before I go into this question, just make an interesting sort of a background note that in the 1980s, China in fact had a very large trade deficit, so large that made it into one of the world's top 10 list. So, but it switched from a very large deficit country to a surplus country and stay very high, essentially since mid-1990s. Now, certainly our European leaders and media often talk about the role of industrial policies, and Yao Yang and other commentators also remarked on industrial policy programs. International Monetary Fund's chief economist, citing a global trade alert database, saying that there are more than 5,000 subsidy policies since 2009. Our moderator, Professor Barry Norton, has written a very influential book on report on industrial policies in China. Our other panelists remarked, and I myself have worked on industrial policies promoting innovation. Professor Bartwick and co-authors look at the industrial policies in shipbuilding. China is a country with tons of industrial policies, for sure. And many of the industrial policies looks very distortionary. Subsidies is only one way to use industrial policy. You have procurement policy, you have tax reduction, you have specialized regulation, you have subsidy to special training, subsidy to special infrastructure for firms, and so on. Long list of tools, long list of policies. So there are a lot of industrial policies. Now, one can certainly see that industrial policies in individual sectors promote. So nature of industrial policy is to use government tools to make certain sectors bigger than what laissez-faire economy will give you. Importantly, at the expense of other sectors, you have to reshuffle resources to promote sectors you want to promote, but importantly, at the expense of other sectors. Those policies clearly can create sector-specific trade surpluses. If you subsidize EVs, you tend to produce and export more EVs than otherwise the case, and you will import less vehicles than otherwise the case. And many carefully done econometric studies confirm this idea that industrial policies tend to generate sector-level trade surpluses. You export more of the sectors that are supported, and import less of the same sectors. I guess the first substantive point I want to make is that, however, we need to make a distinction between sector-level trade balance versus economy-wide trade balance. So, in particular, so here's a point that's maybe somewhat counterintuitive, maybe surprising if you don't normally think about those issues this way. When a subsidized sector expands, it takes resources, engineers, bank loans, factory workers, and so on, away from other sectors. And therefore, the rest of the economy tends to shrink in response to industrial policy promoting particular sector. And those sectors that shrink include those other domestic firms that used to compete with imports. So fewer domestic firms can be effectively competing with imports when industrial policies are supporting some other sectors. As a result, subsidies to exports tend to have the effect of causing both exports and imports to expand. Fewer domestic firms competing with imports, imports become more competitive and actually come in with a greater amount. As a result, the effect of industrial policy, using subsidy as an example, the effect of that on overall trade surplus is much less clear-cut than its effect on sector-level trade surplus. This somewhat surprising, somewhat counterintuitive result is known as the linear symmetry theory. It implies that industrial policy tend to have the effect of simultaneously raising exports in the subsidized sector, but also imports in the non-subsidized sector. In economist jargon, this is known as general equilibrium effect to be different from partial equilibrium effect. Now, for economy with some slack, let's see, with high unemployment rate, this general equilibrium effect may not completely wipe out the partial equilibrium effect, but the general equilibrium effect is still there. That the fact that general equilibrium effect goes in the opposite direction from partial equilibrium effect is still there. So a few implications of the linear symmetry logic. One, tax on imports has the same effect on trade balance as tax on exports. So in fact, this is how the initial linear symmetry idea was stated. So if you raise tariff on imports, sure, imports will fall, but also have the effect to depress your own exports because you have to divert resources away from competing exporting sectors towards less efficient domestic sectors that now compete with imports. And that logic helps us to understand why President Trump's tariff are unlikely to be successful in reducing U.S. trade deficits. Indeed, data does not support the idea of partial equilibrium intuition that higher tariff lead to smaller U.S. trade deficits. That feature, in fact, is an implication of this linear symmetry story. Same logic also tells us that subsidy to imports has the effect of simultaneously raise imports and exports, and they help us to understand why China's government-sponsored import promotion programs do not result in a shrinkage of a trade surplus in Chinese case. In U.S. case, tax on imports does not give you a smaller trade deficit. In Chinese case, some attempt to subsidize imports does not produce a smaller trade surplus either. I'm going to skip, so the same logic, this has to help us understand how trade policy affects trade surplus as well. But I'm going to skip that part in order to have time to talk about the next sub-theme, which is what does sex have to do with China's trade surplus? So first, let me start with a boring reminder of basic macroeconomic identity, then go to talk about sex ratio issue. So starting from very basic macroeconomic accounting, that any country's GDP is equals to its consumption plus investment plus government spending plus trade surplus, one can work out as a matter of accounting that any country's trade surplus is the difference between its savings and investment. All the economists in the room know this extremely well, but it's a reminder to us. This has this basic accounting identity has some profound implications that certainly many journalists and members of Congress, and apparently members of the White House don't always appreciate. Now, China, of course, does not have low investment problems. So therefore, the fact that China has a large trade surplus, it's not coming from too little investment, but it comes from a very, very high savings rate. Maybe I'll make a very quick note, because sometimes I observe international organizations do something that's not exactly kosher. IMF and World Bank will say China has very high savings rate, or maybe some other governments will say China has too high savings rate because Chinese savings rate is so much higher than other countries. Their statement itself, it in fact is not proof that Chinese savings rate is too high, because most economic research on savings behavior, individual savings behavior, tend to conclude that there's a variety of behavioral reasons for individuals or households to save too little. So in fact, economics research tends to give us the presumption that on average, savings rate in most countries is too low. Therefore, average of other countries' savings rate per se does not constitute a optimal savings rate to benchmark Chinese savings rate. So if Chinese savings rate is inefficiently too high, one needs to look for a different way to think about this issue. This is a note perhaps to graduate students in the room to think about how one actually can judge whether a country's savings rate is too high or too low. Now let me come to the sex and sex ratio issue. Many people in the room would know that Chinese population census tells us that China as a whole has more men than women. Men outnumber women by quite a lot. And that's quite striking because in most countries, if you look at the overall population, in countries without wars, without famines, you tend to see somewhat more women than men for the very simple reason that women outlive men. Women's life expectancy is higher than men. The Chinese picture, more men than women, does not come from the fact that the Chinese men outlive Chinese women. That's not the case. Chinese women also outlive Chinese men. So therefore, this surplus males issue is entirely driven by at some point in the past that you have unnaturally more boys to be born relative to girls. So the youth cohort has much more severe surplus male problem that overcome, even if you look at only the old age segment, you still have more women than men. So in order to have nationwide surplus male picture, you have to have very severe imbalanced male to female ratio at the younger cohorts. So when you have a surplus man in the youth cohort, you generate a problem that some men cannot mathematically find a wife or girlfriend. By my calculation, roughly 1 out of every 9 Chinese young men cannot mathematically find a girlfriend or wife. Now, why does it have anything to do with Chinese trade surplus? Well, it has a very important connection. This surplus man problem leads to many behavioral responses, and a household raising their savings rate is one response to this. So young men, parents with a son, respond to increased competitive pressure in the dating marriage market by raising their savings rate because they think higher relative wealth in the dating marriage market might improve their son's chance to get married. Women and parents with a daughter cannot afford to reduce their savings because even though there may be more men in the marriage market, if you are a parent with a daughter, you want your daughter to be matched with best possible men. Best possible men are still in shortage. That's one. And two, to the extent you care about your daughter's bargaining power within marriage, and you don't want your daughter to lose bargaining power, you also want to make sure that your daughter will be as financially secure as possible. So young men, parents with a son, dramatically raise their savings rate. Women, parents with a daughter, do not reduce their savings rate. How important this effect can be? Well, qualitatively, it depends on how much you care about making sure, if you're a parent, making sure your child can have a marriage that if they want to have a marriage, they will have a marriage. If you care a lot about this, you're willing to do a lot to ensure this can be achieved. So by my calculation with Xiaobo Zhang, the rise in the sex ratio in the youth cohort in the last some decades account for about half of the dramatic increase in household savings rate. Chinese household savings rate essentially doubled as a percentage of their income of the last 2.5 decades. As a sex ratio imbalance plays a very important role. Previously, I said that anything that pushes up the savings rate, because trade surplus is saving minus investment. Anything that pushes up savings rate more than investment, it will give you a trade surplus. In calibration with Qing Yuandu Australia professor, we demonstrated that the sex ratio that can be economically, quantitatively very important in understanding the trade surplus picture. So that's one story. Well, another aspect is treatment of private sector entrepreneurs. The Chinese financial system, you have lots of entrepreneurs. Yao Yang and Loren have done, and others have done lots of research about Chinese entrepreneurship, and there are a lot of in the last 40 years or so, Chinese growth rate was underpinned by a burst of entrepreneurship. But the private sector entrepreneurs, that do not have political connection or have connection with the state or banks have a problem, a practical problem that they found it very hard to raise necessary funding for the investment. And the response is to trying to save themselves out of these problems. So Chinese companies are very reluctant to issue dividends either to themselves or to other shareholders, because by necessity, if you're private sector firms, you have to self-save in order to fund your investment, compared to some countries with better developed financial system. So this unequal treatment of private sector entrepreneurs give you a reason to generate a gigantic boost to corporate savings. So sex ratio give you a boost to household savings. Unequal treatment of private sector entrepreneurs give you a very big boost to corporate savings. Collectively, they raise national savings by a huge amount, and that give you the trade surplus pictures. So one economic model that builds on this, formalizes this idea that private sector financing difficulties and productivity growth collectively can generate a trade surplus, can be found in Song, Storeslet, and Silibotti paper. So let me now summarize. So what have we been talking about? Industrial policy, trade policies can generate sector level imbalances, but because of this general equilibrium logic, it may not have very large impact on economy-wide trade surplus. However, it is important to note that some of the industrial policies can still be very distortionary, whether or not they generate economy-wide trade surplus. We still need to think about reforms that can improve both domestic efficiencies and international relations. So even if when German Chancellor came to U.S., even if he completely understood everything I said and said, okay, maybe it does not generate economy-wide trade surplus, the Chinese subsidies, but your EV program, your program in certain machinery sectors, by making their sectors bigger, competing with German sector, that's a problem for them. So some of the industrial policies, not all of them, some of the industrial policies, to the extent they have distortions, it reduces domestic efficiencies and worsens international relations, and therefore there will be reason to reform those separate from its impact on current account surplus. We provide the reason, hopefully by now, that at least you will have an answer for why China's own import promotion program does not seem to reduce its trade surplus. But selected programs, nonetheless, given the infrastructure is already built up on this, potentially can help with managing certain bilateral relationships, to the extent not all trading partners are politically or diplomatically equally important. What does sex or sex ratio have to do with trade surplus? We explain that through a household saving channel. This, what appears to be a social program, what appears to be something not directly related to the economics, in fact can have very profound and underappreciated effect on trade surplus. Sex ratio imbalance itself is a distortion that it makes reduces people's society's well-being. There's no quick fix for that. Nonetheless, if one does not, the society as a whole does not start to work on correcting generational imbalance, 10 years from now or 20 years from now, we may still be talking about generation imbalance and trade surplus that's caused by that. And for that reason, you also need a social program reforms that need to correct the generation imbalance that includes substantially and meaningfully raise social economic status of the girls and women. What does discrimination against private sector entrepreneurs have to do with trade surplus? The channel through its effect on higher corporate savings that will generate greater trade surplus. Here, the thing I want to note is that many financial innovations happening around the world, but including those in China, have the effect of helping private entrepreneurs to ease their access to financing, including many of the innovations done by M Financial. Therefore, in thinking about regulations, the Chinese government is very aggressive in regulating various private sector entrepreneurs, private sector firms, including fintech firms. And some of those regulations may have the effect of making it harder for entrepreneurs to get access to financing, and that indirectly might make it harder to address the trade surplus problem, something that we'd not normally think about.
Shang-jin, thank you so much. We've got a tight schedule here, so we're gonna pass. Thank you very much. That's great. I hope we're not going to have to wait 20 years for the gender balance to retract before we get the trade surplus to come down a little bit, but maybe we will. Let's have everybody come back up to continue the discussion. And Chang-tai, you are, in order to save time here, let's move right into you. Please give us some comments on Shang-jin's very interesting paper.
All right. So let me start by saying that there's no question that, and this is going to pick up from what Yao was talking about. There's no question that sort of the model of growth, so I'm going to just use Yao's words, which is the model of the focus on manufacturing, the focus on innovation, is generating frictions, unease in the rest of the world. The question is, what is the nature of the friction? What is the nature of the unease? And it's typically articulated in, I will first just say that it's typically not well thought through, but Shang-jin gave a very good representation of the argument. And it's basically three sets of arguments. One is the argument about industrial policy. The second argument is about the aggregate surpluses, and generally the argument is made that the aggregate surpluses are linked to industrial policy subsidies. Sometimes, once in a while, people also bring up the argument about deficient aggregate demand in China. That story. I'm going to stake out. So Shang-jin did a great job at making it clear that current account surpluses, current account imbalances, it's really, really hard to build a link between subsidies and industrial policy and aggregate current account imbalances for exactly the logic that he described. I'm going to stick my neck out, and I'm going to go even further. I'm going to say that sort of this discussion, sort of, the statements by Chancellor Merz and the statements by the President of France about, you need to buy more from us because it's a problem that I think that it's those statements or those arguments make no sense. So I'm going to make the case that it's really not about the current account imbalances, but it's really about industrial policy subsidies plus something else. Okay, so first, like Shang-jin showed a very interesting figure. He showed you this time series plot of the current account surpluses over time in China, and in 2007, 2008, if I remember his number, China had a current account surplus of about 9-10% of GDP, right? About 10 to 9. By 2014 or 2015, the current account surplus was basically at zero. It was there in his figure, right? It was there in his figure. The issues were still there, right? So the fact that the current account surplus was at zero in 2014, 2015, it doesn't change the problem, right? And the current account surplus has gone back up, but it's still, I'm going to say, compared to 2008, it's still tiny. It's tiny. It's 3%, 2%. I mean, we can debate about the numbers, but it's not 10% of GDP. So I just think that it's this fundamentally faulty logic, and I'm going to say, that it's our fault, like as economists, it comes like, how we train our students, that we teach them, like in our first econ class, we say, output is equal to consumption plus investment plus the plus the trade surplus. So which is true as an accounting identity. It's terrible economics. It's terrible economics because it's an accounting identity, but it gets you to think that if you're to change one thing on the right-hand side, that then the thing that's automatically going to change is a thing on the left-hand side. It's a bit like saying, I'm going to look at data of people and I'm going to look at their income and I'm going to look at how much they paid for housing and I'm going to reach the conclusion that if you spend more for housing, your income is going to go up. That there is an identity, but it's really dangerous to make those causal statements. What do I think the root of it? So I'm going to try to make some sense into this the argument. So, and it really is, how do you want to think about, say, sort of the push that Yao was talking about for manufacturing and for innovation? And let's just assume that none of this translates into a current account surplus, that the current account surplus is generated by all the other forces that Shang-jin was talking about, the sex ratio, the discrimination against private entrepreneurs. But the industrial policy piece, again, just as a matter of logic, is really hard to make the argument about how that leads to a current account surplus. But the rest of the world really does have an issue with that, okay? What is the issue, right? The issue. So suppose that, let's just take it as given that one of the things that's happened in China is that there's been a big push towards subsidizing Chinese EVs. Okay? How does one want to think about that? One response that you could give is, the Chinese want to subsidize EVs, so now I can buy an EV for $10,000. The first response of an economist, and this may be one of the reasons that people hate economists, I'm going to say, this is lovely. This is great. It's almost like, suppose I'm a student at UCSD and I love this place and I want to come here, and UCSD announces they're gonna completely eliminate tuition. What's going to be my response as a student? I say, great, this is lovely, because I was going to pay whatever the tuition is. I was going to pay the tuition is. You want to give it to me for free? I'm going to say, great. I would say, great. Now, what's a possible problem with this? I don't know who your main competitor is, but let's say it's UCLA. The people at UCLA are cash-strapped, and then you guys have this rich donor that eliminates tuition. Well, the people at UCLA are not going to be that happy. Right? I'm going to be having to say, hey, this is unfair competition. How can you give that much financial aid? So we're going to have to do something, or else we're going to lose our best students. Okay? So what is the equivalent of that? Well, it's the other domestic car manufacturers in the rest of the world. So they're going to suffer. They're going to suffer, but the consumers are all going to gain. Right, as a client. So part of the response, it's I'm going to say, to go back to my example, it's the UCLAs of the world, right? So clearly, if UCSD does this, the UCLAs of the world. Who is your main competitor? All right.
I completely disagree with you.
Absolutely, that's great. But the point is that, and Shang-jin touched upon this as well, that it generates these tremendous dislocations, right? It generates, if you're going to subsidize EVs, then all the German car manufacturers and the American car manufacturers are going to have a real problem. Are going to have then. But the question is, why isn't the rest of the world welcoming this? Why aren't the consumers in the rest of the world? Why aren't the users of cheap and better Chinese technology?
But if you're going to ask that question, why don't you ask an even more immediate one, which is, if Chinese manufacturing productivity and exports are so great, how come the Chinese currency isn't appreciating? The renminbi has depreciated in real terms 20% over the last 3 years. So, in other words, you said when you started, you said we need a general equilibrium analysis. We can't just look at identities. Couldn't agree more. But then do it. Let's have a general equilibrium analysis. There's something wrong with this system. And so naturally, Germany says, you know what? I don't really want to have my automobile industry wiped out.
Yeah, so let me get to my next question, which is, there's no question that this generates losses for China. Okay, so the question is, let me put it this way. If you have a country that is willing to subsidize their product, that the product that you buy, okay, and it's hugely distortionary for them, okay, you don't care about the fact, I mean, that you don't necessarily care about the fact that it's hugely distortionary for them. What you care about is your access to this cheap product, okay, to each product. So the question is, and I think there the answer is that it's hugely, that it generates the tremendous dislocation for the UCLAs of the world. The next question is, why aren't people, I'm going to say, that suppose that you make that argument that it's the equivalent of free tuition. Why aren't people happy with that argument? Okay, and it goes to the question of, like, I'm going to put the question in this way, and maybe this is sort of a question for Yao. Why is China doing this? Like, why is China, that if it's clear, suppose the argument is that what you're doing is that you're screwing over your domestic consumers, your domestic consumers are paying the cost, and it's subsidizing consumers in the rest of the world, okay? Why is China doing this, okay? And I'm going to throw out a hypothesis. I'm going to throw out, like, if I think about, let me just step out. Okay, like my model for, like, how to think about what's going on in the U.S. right now, that it's about like basically that the U.S. is trying to use its political and economic leverage to try to gain economic advantage with basically the smaller countries of the world. Okay. The question is China trying to do something equivalent to that? And I'll throw out a possible story for that it's not exactly that, but there are some similarities. That one reason that you can possibly think of, or why is it that China is pursuing this industrial policy, and why is it subsidizing its products from the rest of the world? It could be, the way to think about it is that it's using this to try to buttress its national security in the following sense. That is, one way in which you can possibly think about it is that it looks at the world and it finds itself vulnerable. I mean, that's the way I think about this campaign for manufacturing. That's the way I think about the campaign for innovation. That it's about trying to reduce its vulnerabilities with respect to the rest of the world. And then maybe you can think about subsidizing exports in exactly the same way. That it's about trying to build up economic leverage so that whenever you need it, you can use it for your geopolitical goals and maybe that is part of what is also driving the fact that the rest of the world has an issue with this. So I'll stop there, and then
Let's pass the mic back to Yaoyang, because really we're asking the general equilibrium impact on the world of Chinese policies.
First, I'm not going to say that there is no general equilibrium effect, right? So I think Shang-jin's comments have a lot of truth in it. But the problem is that we have to think about the direct effect versus kind of a secondary effect, right? So this is what was it called, Long-Chandelier effect? That's a French name, right? which means it's really difficult for the secondary effect to override the direct effect, right? So which means if you subsidize export, of course you are going to increase your trade surplus. That's almost for sure, at least to me. Of course you can argue this is an empirical question, yeah, but I haven't seen any study to show that the secondary effects finally override the direct effects, right? Particularly in China, we subsidize export directly. That's a tax rebate when you export. To me, that's the wrong policy. We need more domestic consumption, not more export. I think, come back to my comments. I mean, policymakers don't follow our economic rationale. That's the lesson I have learned over the last several decades, right? Because they have such a firm objective or belief that manufacturing is the cornerstone for China to become a strong country. So whatever cost we are going to pay, we pay it. Okay.
And that's my point.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's really hard to change.
We're willing to pay the cost.
Right.
You're willing, China is willing to pay the cost, but other countries aren't. And China is not willing to say, we're going to take steps to make sure that all the costs stay within our borders. We're indifferent to the costs that spill over the borders, that show up in Brazil or Germany, to say nothing of the United States. Yeah, we're kind of running out of time, right? What are our instructions from the? 5 or 6 more minutes. Okay. So, Loren, quickly.
But I guess what I would say that although there's always been these strategic concerns, there's other paths that they could have followed in order to be able to continue to deepen the industrial upgrading. They didn't need to go down the path that they did. And so back 20 years ago, they decided, look, we've exhausted the returns to the path that we've been on. We need to leapfrog. And that is in some sense the beginning. And it's only in some sense the frictions that those policies generated that it kind of reinforced this view that they needed to go ahead and to do even more to try to, for these strategic considerations.
Yeah. I would also add, there are also industrial policies that don't subsidize, that specifically restrict the import of goods. And they're much more important and much more quantitatively significant than the flim-flam of the Shanghai import promotion program, right? So imports of capital goods unrelated to semiconductors have dropped by 1 percentage point of GDP over the last 7 years. I mean, what's going on here? This is a growing economy. You know, it's purposely weaning itself from imported goods. Anyway, we got time for maybe 1 or 2 at most more questions. Yes, go ahead. Here, I got a microphone, right?
Yeah, 2 things. One, just statistically, I think if you compare the trend in China's current account surplus to its own GDP to surplus as a percentage of global GDP, you'll see a very different story. I want to go back to the beginning because I always find this fascinating on, you know, what accounts for the slowdown in China's growth and why it's only growing, whatever, 3 to 4%. So maybe it's doing everything wrong. And certainly there's lots of things China could do to raise potential growth. There's lots of things lots of countries could do to raise potential growth. But how much is just explained by simple convergence? Like, what other major G20-sized economies are growing 3 or 4%? And how much does demographics explain to it? Labor force growth.
I mean, the levels are still low. I mean, yes, I mean, it's still big, but the levels of productivity are still, you know, very, very low.
I mean, and that's the puzzle. So when productivity in China begins to go ahead and slow, it's occurring at a much earlier point in its development relative to advanced countries than what you would have seen than in the historical experience of Korea, Taiwan, or Japan. That is in some sense the puzzle. It happens much earlier. It's happening at a point in time where China's per capita GDP is maybe a 6th or a 7th of the United States. It's a bit harder to compare the productivity in levels, but I would say that the best estimates would say that at that point in time, productivity in levels in China was about 30% of what it was for advanced countries. And so that's why I think my own kind of take that China had enormous amounts of room to continue to grow, again, on a path that they were, for a variety of misreading of their own economic lessons, for reasons of hubris, for reasons of strategic considerations. They end up going down a particular path that has been extremely costly both for themselves, but now they also have to deal with consequences of all the frictions that they have generated as well. So in some sense, had China gone on a slightly different route, they would be even more formidable today. And so, as I said, my basic kind of take about Chinese entrepreneurialism, if the good entrepreneurs weren't constrained by the policy environment in China, if they weren't constrained with having to deal with barriers outside, we'd have even a harder time being able to compete, again, with them. So the biggest losers in lots of this is China, because Chinese entrepreneurs are facing these kinds of constraints, these enormous costs that have been directed to support these sectors. These costs are being socialized. Somebody has to eat the cost. And so throughout Chinese development, it's always been the case that somebody has to eat the cost. That ends up being just an enormous drag on the entire development process. And so that's why you can't separate what goes on the supply side and all these supply side policies from what's going on the demand side. Because the same distortions that are pulling down the productivity and generating all the inefficiency and all these resources that are being pulled in to support that, they're just being sucked out of households. They're just being sucked out from other sectors of the economy that have these longer run implications for demand and just kind of contribute to some of these imbalances that we happen to see. Now, would this alleviate the trade surplus? No, but it contributes to other kinds of imbalances. And when there's imbalances, then the government feels like, oh yes, we need to spend billions and trillions in infrastructure because we need to maintain expenditure on the demand side to absorb the goods that we need. So it has a common.
Huge set of issues that we've opened up here. We're basically out of time. I'm going to ask Yaoyang to he's come the longest. He's come from the farthest distance, and he's got a nice perspective on things. So Yaoyang, I'm going to ask you to just say your last piece and respond to what we've just heard.
Well, thank you, Barry. The final words to me. I think there are long-term issues with the Chinese economy, but right now, they're not the urgent things, right? Convergence, you talk about the convergence, that's a supply side issue, right? But if you look at the Chinese economy, we have a huge amount of redundancy in every sector. You just name it. So convergence is not going to explain China's slowdown, right? Because China has huge potentials. The problem, basically, to me, is just on the demand side. It's just a lack of demand, and also the government's attention on the supply side. I don't know. Probably, I think we haven't given Keynes enough respect, right? So we have, over the last several decades, we have been taught basically by the Chicago school, the supply side school. But in China's case, probably that's just too much. We have emphasized supply just too much. It's time for us to re-rate Keynes and then to boost domestic consumption in China.
Wow. So much on the table. We're going to have to stop because we're just out of time. I mean, if people want to stay, we're going to shut down the cameras and close the online portion. I guess if people want to stay and keep talking, we could do that too. But let me just thank so many people were involved in this. Of course, primarily our guests who came from a long way. Chang-tai Hsieh, who envisioned this and made it happen. Really something tremendous, and many people all around who helped make it work. So thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Good night all.